I've been experimenting with humor to drain energy, which reminds me, does anyone here have any updog? Updog? If I didn't know what updog was, I would at least ask me.
Welcome to the Dreams of Consciousness podcast. If you would be so kind, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, hello. I am Grant Netzorg. I am the guitarist and singer for the band In the Company of Serpents of Denver, Colorado. Speaking of sirens. Are you getting that? Are you hearing like the
yeah
outside my house? Pardon that?
It's all right. I used to do the podcast at gigs. And so I would be sitting outside the venue with the bands doing the interviews that way. And we would get all kinds of background noise and, sometimes things like firecrackers and things like that. So this is, I don't know. I mean, to me, it all just adds to the ambience of the podcast.
There you go. It adds character to this unique moment in time we happen to inhabit.
How would you describe the music that you make? How would you describe the music of In the Company of Serpents?
I don't know. It's hard for me to kind of pin down, but I guess for me, a big part of what I try and strive for when writing heavier music is there needs to be a certain level of catharsis there for me, both in its performance and just in kind of like the nature of the material itself. So that's kind of where I start from. Like I want something to be fairly visceral if I'm writing heavy music. Of course, if I'm not trying to write like something heavy and visceral, then it doesn't necessarily need to be all that. But that's kind of my springboard that I begin with. And I guess from there, for people that maybe are unfamiliar with us, we broadly get categorized as sludge or doom. But one of the big touchstones that people always kind of seem to single out for us is that there's kind of an Ennio Morricone eerie spaghetti western vibe kind of running through the broader mix of your other key ingredients of sludge and doom. But I don't know, it's I struggle to describe our own stuff, which is I can tell you all about all of the different things that inspired all the different songs on the album, so on and so forth. But then if you just want me to nutshell our sound broadly, I don't know if I can articulately do so.
Broadly, you mentioned doom metal, or other people referring to as doom metal. It's fair to say that In the Company of Serpents makes slow, heavy music, and as you noted, there's a kind of a twangy neo-western, almost cinematic quality to it as well.
Yeah, I like that characterization. Yeah, and I like specifically the word cinematic there, because it's like film scores and just these more sort of sprawling, open, dusty sort of landscape aesthetics that you get from a lot of this music is something that is definitely a point of inspiration for me and part of how I think about music as I compose it.
Now, why is that? Why are you taking this more cinematic approach as opposed to, I would say a lot of bands are very, in terms of song structure, more lyric based in terms of like verse, chorus, solo, chorus, that kind of approach. Why are you taking this more ambient cinematic approach?
It's, if I had to put a pin on it, it's probably just from my own love of film. I'm a big movie buff, and it's been a central part of my upbringing too. Like I remember watching all kinds of movies with my dad when I was a kid, and now, especially when we're talking about a quarantine sort of world, definitely putting some mileage on our DVD player. But I also just have never really tried to write in a way that's like, okay, it's got to be verse, chorus, bridge, whatever structure. If I have some songs that have wound up that way, that it's probably by accident. But I try to evoke certain feelings or emotions in what we're doing musically, more so than I try to, I don't know, I guess nail a formula. And so that sometimes lends itself a bit more easily to that more, I guess, as you put it, cinematic approach.
Now, in terms of being a movie buff, are you specifically influenced by Western film scores? You mentioned Ennio Morricone.
Yeah, I mean, I love his stuff. And that's just been super fresh in my mind because my wife and I have been blasting a bunch of Ennio Morricone stuff over the last couple of days. So, like, of course, it's a touchstone for me. But, like, yeah, that's an aesthetic, I think, that certainly informs part of how we write. But I mean, I'm like all functioning adults. Like I'm all over the board, man. I've got all kinds of influences. So like Yeah, westerns are definitely a key touchstone for me, but there's a lot in the stew, so to speak.
Let's give the listeners a little bit of background to In the Company of Serpents. Just briefly, tell me when you formed and what you set out to accomplish at the time.
Sure. So we initially were founded as a two-piece. I formed the band with the co-founding member was JJ Anselmi, who also just put out a pretty cool book on doom metal in general. Well, not in general. It's more specific than that. But he has a new book out called Doomed to Fail. It just came out. Pretty righteous. Anyhow, he and I were both in as we're talking about Western tinged shit. Is it okay to cuss? This is a podcast, right?
Yeah. All good.
Okay. So he and I were both in somewhat more like country tinged bands about a decade ago, and we were both of our bands were playing a show together. And during sound check, I was like checking my guitar levels to some riffs by the band Earth, Dylan Carlson, and JJ immediately recognized him, like basically the only other person in the room who's like, that's an Earth riff. Like that's off of Hexer, Printing in the Infernal Method. I know that tune. And we struck up a conversation about that and how, as much as we liked the bands we were in, we'd really love to be playing something kind of heavier and more in that like drone doom end of the spectrum that a band like Earth might be placed. And so he and I just kind of struck up a friendship from there and started jamming together. And within the space of a few months, we wrote and recorded the first In the Company of Serpents record. And that was like our first record, I would say, is pretty straightforward doom. And our sound didn't really evolve into what it's kind of morphed into now until sometime later. But JJ left the band, and then for a long time I carried on with another drummer as a two-piece for actually all of the rest of our recorded material. But currently we are a three-piece. On drums we've got JP Damron from Vermin Womb and Clinging to the Trees of a Forest Fire, and another pretty rad band you should keep an eye out for called Bleakheart. He's on drums. And then we've got Ben Pitts, longtime friend from the Denver music scene that I've been wanting to jam with for quite some time. And he's on bass and lap steel guitar. And then I round things out on guitar and vocals. I guess that's kind of the quick overview history. We're a two-piece for forever. Now we're a three-piece. And
besides your friendship with JJ, why found the band as a duo? Why not flesh it out with additional members?
It wasn't for lack of desire to like incorporate other people. It was just kind of like I had the itch to just like start writing and performing this music, and we started getting shows. And so I was like, fuck it. I don't care if we have a bass player or not at this point. Like, let's just go play. And, we hit the ground running from that perspective, and things moved the way they did. And after a certain point of, playing as a two-piece, it almost became like an act of defiance to just continue as a two-piece, because people kept being like, oh man, like you should get a bass player. I'm like, oh, should I? And then, I'd make some tweak to my backline rig to just make it that much more absurd for a single guitarist to be playing through like 3 stacks of amplifiers and plenty of like low end modulation going on, so that it still kind of covered that sonic territory that a bass player typically would have covered. But I'd never really been like anti expanding the sound of the band. It was just kind of like we just got busy and started getting opportunities, and in lieu of training somebody up as a third member for most of the bulk of our existence as a band up until the last 2 years, I was fine with that. But then as one kind of grows in their songwriting, it can be limiting to just keep something as bare bones as a two-piece. And I found myself really wanting to do a lot more in the studio and not being at ease with the fact that if we did it in the studio, we would need to play it live. And I didn't want to like just rely too heavily on like sampling other performances and parts that I'd done in a studio, you know. So that's when it's actually like Ben joined the band as our third member a couple of years ago at this point. So that's really like I had eyes as soon as we finished recording our previous record, Ain Safar. I knew that I wanted to expand upon what we were doing musically, and Ben's a wonderful multi-instrumentalist. He's like the type of dude you can just throw any instrument at and he's going to be able to make his way around it. Like he's not a bass player typically, and the guy's in like 5 other bands right now currently, and I've known him to be in like another 15 that are now defunct. I had high confidence in being able to just say, hey, like I need you to play bass, and then also you're going to be playing these eerie drones on a lap steel guitar live. And of course he took to it wonderfully, and he's basically developed his own style of playing that allows him to continue to play bass while still kind of getting these ethereal, ghostly sort of drones going on a lap steel guitar at the same time. So it's been cool. We've used lap steel guitars tuned to open minor tunings for sort of ambiance, I suppose, or just like laying down this sort of like ethereal quality that kind of sits in the background of a lot of our recordings, basically every record except for our very first one. And that had always been something that I had to relegate to the studio. And then if we wanted to replicate it live, I'd have to record it to like a sample pedal or something like that, because as a 2-piece, I wasn't able to play the lap steel and create these drones and then also play guitar. But now with Ben having joined, that's an element that we can now do live that he's picked up on quite wonderfully. So it's been cool.
So I definitely want to talk more about Ben's contributions and how they've affected your sound. I want to circle back to something that you said. You mentioned you and JJ had been working or had been playing in Western tinged bands, or in I guess more like a country style. Is that right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because that first album is pretty straightforward sludge doom, but you know it seems like
it's the least of it's the material that least reflects the immediacy of us having just come from country bands. Is that what you're getting at?
Well that, but it seems like, I mean, everybody starts with kind of a bass line and then circles back to their roots a little bit. An example of what I'm talking about is a lot of thrash bands and death metal bands start off, you know, trying to play as fast and as intense and incorporating as many blast beats as they can, but then within a few albums get more comfortable incorporating traditional heavy metal style leads and melodies and things like that, or in some cases, you know, folk music and things like that.
Sure.
It's something that we see in metal bands from time to time. In your case, did it take some time for you to feel comfortable incorporating those kind of elements, those Western elements, into your music?
I would say to varying degrees. I've never felt uncomfortable incorporating that stuff. I guess I've just always wanted to make sure that it was in service of the music that we were writing. And like if it sounded kind of shoehorned in to just like have some twangy spaghetti Western guitar, I wouldn't have really wanted to do it. However, it is something that did sort of evolve into our sound more naturally. Basically, like I've had a I don't know how much of a like guitar gear person you might or might not be, but there's the Fender Twin amplifier. There's first of all there's hundreds of different versions of the same thing, but it has this pretty characteristic sound of this vibrato or tremolo sort of sound that I've always loved on clean guitar sounds, that has this like twangy, eerie sort of quality that I just love to write around. And so at a certain stage, and at this point, this was, you know, over 5-6 years ago. In fact, I mean, yeah, this was maybe 2014, if not earlier. I got a Fender Twin and started using that as the sound for all of my quote unquote clean tones in the band. And so I would be switching between this very, very loud, and compared to a lot of not that necessarily clean, but clean compared to the rest of the sound of my rig. I would be jumping between that and then, like the whole amplifier wall doom thing. And so from a writing perspective, it just seemed to kind of come naturally. These are elements that I really, enjoyed and had loved growing up and hearing them in a more cinematic context. And when I got, the right tool for the job, so to speak, and started playing through this amp and hearing these sounds, it became almost second nature to just start writing those sort of parts and incorporating them in the broader aesthetic of our work.
We live in a chasm at the mouth of the Her lips are wet with venom and her quarry will fall. Ride the wave upon her breath, live as though there isn't death at all. There is no self, only the all, the world and soul and magical. The sky is the vessel, the celestial moon. The soil beneath us, the seed and our tune. Born into the universe, the great sea we must traverse. To the place preceding form, flux and turn us set the course. The fire within us is the source of all flame. The vital force unleashed and untamed. Boundless bigger, ask not how, acts upon eternal now. Pure and vital energy
So your fourth album, Lux, is set to be released on May 15th. Let's talk a little bit about the writing of this album and how it came together.
Sure. So I guess from a thematic perspective, there's a lot to unpack, I suppose, and so I'll try to do so without rambling too much.
Would you say that the lyrical and thematic aspects influenced the musical aspects of the album? Did you come up with your lyrical themes first?
It's kind of a weird chicken egg scenario that, like, it's hard to say, save for specific examples when certain things came. Without trying to sound too weird here, I'll just posit that I'm very interested in the idea of precognition and then also retrocausation. Precognition, we're probably most of us are probably familiar with the idea of, like, you think of an old friend that maybe you haven't seen in 10 years or something like that, and then next thing you know, that you get a text from them, right? So that could be a sort of precognitive experience. But there's also the notion of retrocausation, where for lack of a better description, it seems that certain future events help create the present. And so that's definitely a factor on, at least in my personal experience with the writing of this particular record, because I thought thematically I knew what the record was about pretty firmly as we went in to go and record it. And then as our lives sort of developed throughout the course of that, even after the recording, I came to learn that certain compositions were about much different things, or were about much more than just what I had initially presumed them to be about. So I don't mean to be evasive in this response, but I don't really know, because okay, it might help to give you some more context. So the broader theme of the record is something of a toying with the idea of a prima materia, or a fundamental root essence that pervades the manifest world, the manifest universe, like existence itself, right? And so from the perspective of, all sorts of different esoteric minds, this has been characterized as a lot of different things, right? The chief analogies that I've employed in this record are all is mind, all is sound, and all is light. Particularly all is light, with a record called Lux, or the Latin for light. The light analogy is fairly central for me, but the idea that everything can be boiled down to light at its fundamental essence. And so we're talking about, like, the fabric of the all, of divinity or God or being, whatever you want to characterize that as, right? And so on one level, the album functions as a form of, I guess, esoteric prayer in that capacity. At the same time, in the last couple of years, we've seen the birth of my daughter, whom we named a name that gets its origins from that same Latin lux root essence. So our daughter Lucia was born in the last couple of years. So on one level, the album functions as this form of prayer, and then on the same time, it's kind of a communication to my infant daughter, whose name is also tied to this whole sort of solar or light imagery. So that's what I thought it was about, right? Broadly speaking. But when you get into, I guess, esoteric treatments of solar cycles, there's always a dawn and there's a dusk, right? And there's themes of birth, rebirth, death, and renewal, right? I wasn't thinking about the death facets of this cycle when I was initially writing it. But as we finished recording, basically down to almost the hour, it transpired that my spouse's father passed away basically as we finished recording this. And I had no idea at the time, right? And I had these two compositions that I have a friend from the Colorado Symphony performing on. He plays an instrument called a viola del mare on it. And I had thought of these two tracks as being called Dawn and Dusk, because they're very similar composition. And I was thinking of using them as basically bookends to different sort of transition points on the record, without really thinking of the implications of Dawn and Dusk from, like, a life-death perspective. And of course, we have this experience where death very tangibly starts to impact our lives in the loss of a near and dear loved one. And we wound up playing this recording that we had basically finished on the day and almost to the hour of his passing at his memorial service that transpired like a week later. So I guess this is a circuitous route of me kind of getting back to that notion of precognition and retrocausation, because I didn't think it was about these certain themes at the time, with the ends of cycles and the subsequent implications of rebirth too. But it's very much there. So a lot of these ideas seemed to be getting sort of pulled forward by something that's beyond me, from a temporal perspective. I hope that didn't sound too batshit. Does that make any sense?
Well, I mean, to be fair, I don't really have any background in what you're talking about. So whether or not, well, no, I mean, I'm just saying, whether or not I personally understood it, I will say that from looking at the notes for the album, this is an incredibly well-considered album. And in terms of the philosophy and the thought process behind it, it's clear that you put a lot of thought into it. And even post-creation, a lot of thought into the way it ties into certain themes and certain life events and things like that. I will ask you, because you brought up esoteric thinking and, to some extent, the supernatural, or, things beyond our understanding. To what extent do you believe in magic or esoteric knowledge? And I know that's a, that seems like a weird question, but it is.
It's not a weird question. I just read a record that's drenched in that shit, so it's a fair question. I guess without like giving away too much about my own personal practices or beliefs, I believe, or let's dispense with the word belief actually for this conversation. Magic, I guess, is something that I've experienced in my own life. And as far as the Western occult tradition is concerned, that's definitely something that's had an influence on me, and certainly has some echoes in the themes of this record. Without going too deeply into it, I've been captivated by Kabbalistic thought, particularly Hermetic Kabbalah, sort of the approach of, I guess, the backbone of the Western Hermetic Kabbalistic esoteric tradition is definitely something that has multiple points of reference on the new record. And, to no one's surprise, given that we named our last record Ein Safar, which is the third veil of negative pre-existence just prior to manifestation in Kabbalistic philosophy. But it's definitely a prominent factor in my work.
Now, do you believe in magic in a literal sense, or is magic a kind of metaphor or way of looking at the physical world?
I think you may have answered your own question there in that latter description, but and for the sake of not getting into pedantic arguments about what is or isn't on this call, I'll just say that when I talk about magic, I'm talking about this through the lens of like the Western esoteric perspective, and magic with a K, sort of magic. And a lot of that, I think, like when people are unfamiliar with the Western occult tradition, a lot of times they can misconstrue just what it is that's going on, or is or isn't going on. That because or isness is not necessarily of prime importance here. And I guess there's, for me, a current in that broader sphere of things that's about radical self-transformation and trying to achieve higher potential of one's self, kind of grasping towards self-actualization, things like that. So for fear of not getting too wooey on this conversation here, I guess I'll just kind of leave it at that. And that I've found profound meaning in my own spiritual journey, exploring these things, and that I'll just say that they can be profoundly transformative and can lead to remarkable things in one's own experience. And what somebody else might call mere happenstance or coincidence might be a profound synchronicity for somebody else. So I suppose it's up to each individual and whatever their own path happens to be.
Crowley said that the world is black to the blind, but blue and gold to everyone who has the one true sight.
It's a very Jovian choice of colors that you picked right there.
But in terms of believing in magic or not believing in magic, if you don't want to see it, it's not there, and if you do see it, then it's there for you. He
also there's a great quote. He said, and I'm going to paraphrase here and probably butcher it, much to the chagrin of any Lemites that might be listening to your show, but he said something to the effect of, when you perform certain experiments, certain results follow. The practitioner would be well advised not to attribute objective reality to anything.
I spoke to a musician some time back who said that music is magic. Music is a form of magic, because music is an ephemeral thing that causes events in the physical world. Do you feel that your music is a form of magic?
I think I would agree with that characterization. I think that's well put. Whoever that musician was that characterized that, I think music is absolutely magic. But I think that there's a whole lot that we don't recognize in our mundane experience that is magic as well. I think that as a rule, humans are fundamentally creative beings, and that our creative capacities, however they may manifest, is a form of magic in and of itself. It's manifesting something out of nothing, like just the capacity to write or create anything is a form of manifestation that I think is fundamentally divine.
Now, would you, because I've read a little bit of Crowley, I've read a few things here and there. I wouldn't say I know a tremendous amount about any of this, but would you say that your music or your songs are spells?
I don't know about that particularly, because when I think of a spell, there's a particular outcome or desired effect that might be in place there. That's not necessarily how I would characterize our compositions. I mean, have I written things that might have that sort of element to them potentially, but by and large, I wouldn't say that all of our songs are spells, so to speak. But I guess this could devolve into a pedantic discussion of what a spell is or isn't.
My podcast is nothing if not pedantic. Epic.
Not so far, man. This is a pretty cool conversation so far. So yeah, no, I don't get that sense.
I'm known for epic arguments about whether a black death metal band is more black or more death, and whether or not their corpse paint makes them a black metal band.
The only answer is none more black. We're gonna make a fucking Spinal Tap. Yeah. So I think music is, in any creative sort of pursuit, is fundamentally magical in my perspective. But I think that we're all constantly practicing magic without necessarily the vocabulary or self-awareness to realize it. So yeah, I suppose they're all spells.
how to create a song.
Let's talk about the recording and creation of the album. Tell me where this was recorded.
So basically everything that we've done since our EP Merging in Light, we have done with Dave Otero at Flatline Audio in Denver here. Dave is more notorious for working with a lot of like death metal type bands. Like he's done the last handful of Cattle Decapitation records. He's done all the Primitive Man stuff, Legion, Chemists, yeah. But we've worked with Dave. We're fortunate to have a dude who basically like is renowned for his ability to produce intensely heavy cathartic records in our backyard. So yeah, like we've been working with him basically since I want to say like I think that record came out in like 2014, might have been 2015. We've been working with him locally then there, but yeah, so his studio's like maybe 25 minutes away from my house, and we basically booked a couple weeks in August of last year, and all of the material had been written prior to then, with few exceptions. Like there were maybe one or two little nuances that we decided to add in studio, but more or less we kind of knew what we were going to lay down when we came in there. Yeah, I guess like the writing process for this thing, like some of these songs are straight up like 3 years old at this point. Like our last record came out in 2017, and like I had already begun writing some of the material that's on this record at that point. Like a key example would be the opening track, which you can find on our Bandcamp, has been leaked, called The Fool's Journey. And that's a song I began writing like basically in 2017. Before Ben even joined the band. And the basic premise of that tune is that somebody does a tarot reading on the fate of humanity should we continue our trajectory unabated. And it spells, in no uncertain terms, bad news, right? And so then the idea thematically then is that a second question is posed, well, then what can we do about it? And it fundamentally points to our own agency and our ability to self-empower. But ultimately that if we're going to want to avoid fucking calamity, we've got to act. And so when I wrote that song, like initially, like the first riffs started coming together 3 years ago, as I mentioned. When I initially wrote that, I thought that maybe that song, like the calamity that I was describing was stuff like climate change, fascistic totalitarian rulers, just nationalism, zealotry, all things of that nature, which, you know, it may well still be very much about. But then lo and behold, fast forward three years later, and when we're actually releasing this song in the midst of a fucking pandemic, I'm like, oh, maybe this is about some other things. So back to like what I was talking about earlier with the idea of retrocausation, the idea that certain future events, kind of unbeknownst to us, might be kind of self-creating certain moments in our present tense. That song definitely has a lot of that sort of luster for me, in terms of just, you know, I personally thought it was about and wound up being about. So that's one example. I can go into further ones if you want to talk about more about the record or whatever. I don't want to ramble too much.
Yeah, we don't need to go necessarily into the lyrical themes song by song. I do want to talk about a few songs which you've talked about a little bit already. You have a few guest musicians on the album, a couple of whom will probably be familiar to listeners of this podcast, and one who may not be. Let's talk about the guys that people will know.
Sure.
Ethan McCarthy from Primitive Man and Ben Hutcherson from Chemists are on this album.
Yeah.
What can you tell me about their involvement and their contributions?
Sure. So I totally wrote that song that they both appear on, Scales of Mott. I wrote the dirge part that they both perform on very much with those two specific dudes in mind. And just to give a bit of history, you know, I've known both those guys for ages. Ethan has been, of course, instrumental in putting Denver on the map in terms of like just being a place that heavy bands will come and play. He's been running DIY venues and basically giving any band that like shows up with a full set an opportunity to perform for as long as I can recall in terms of the Denver heavy music scene. And we were one of those bands that also he gave early opportunities to, and now it's since morphed into a different venue, but at one point he ran a DIY space called Blastomat that like gave us some of our earliest shows. And so he's been one of those dudes that's like instrumental in making Denver a place that people think about when they think of heavy music. And so he's been an old friend in that capacity. And then also, of course, at this point, we now share band members. JP, our drummer in the company of Serpents, also played for ages with Ethan in the band Clinging to the Trees of a Forest Fire, and now Vermin Womb. So yeah, like we've known each other for a bit. And then Ben and Chemis have been fantastic as well. Like I remember one of their very first shows that they played was at this Denver Doom Fest that we were all playing on in like, I want to say like 2011 or 2012. Like, and we've known each other for quite some time as well. And Ben specifically had asked me to perform on a track called Three Gates on Chemis's record Hunted. And that was, I'd never really like guested on another person's record before. I found it to be a really cool experience. And kind of with that in mind, I was like, well, shit, like I should be inviting my friends to play on our record. Like, why not write a fucking song that like has them in mind? So that song, Scales of Mott, kind of ends with this dirge where I guess what I had in mind was that like early on, like I remember like when I was first getting into death metal, I remember hearing Deicide. And one of the first things I remember thinking about was like how they'd always record like the low guttural vocal, but then double it up with like some screeched sort of fucking banshee vocal over the top,
Hell yeah.
So you'd get the like low guttural coupled with the like type of thing, like over the top. And so I know basically like for my money, there isn't a gnarlier low guttural vocal than Ethan's. So I wanted Ethan to do the low end. And then Ben, if you've heard his other band, Glacial Tomb, does a very gnarly, sort of screechy, almost black metal-y, sort of like, like fried out sort of vocal thing. So I had them sing that part kind of in tandem with that sort of aesthetic in mind, where you'd get the low guttural vocal doubled with the high witchy, screechy, whatever the fuck you want to call it, vocal over the top. And I think it's one of my favorite tracks on the record, and I'm stoked that my very talented buddies whose bands I very much admire would want to participate.
And so you mentioned the viola d'amore earlier. Mm-hmm. Paul Primus from the Colorado Chamber Players plays the viola d'amore. Mm-hmm. Tell me about that. Tell me about the instrument.
It's super cool. He's a friend I've kind of made inadvertently through my interest in Kabbalistic thought. So his day job is he plays in the Colorado Symphony, but he's also interested in Kabbalistic tradition and introduced me to a local Denver sort of Institute of Kabbalistic Study. And this is more of like traditional Jewish Kabbalistic study. I don't know how much you're familiar with Kabbalah, but like there's a lot of different sort of flavors of it, so to speak, some of which might more be associated with like the magical or Western esoteric tradition that we've been discussing earlier. And then, a more traditionally Jewish Kabbalistic approach. But anyways, he and I became friends kind of through that sphere. And he has just a wonderful collection of remarkable instruments at his house, and including this one, the viola d'amore, that basically I only know. So I'm not a classical music guy. I'm not like a classically trained person. Like I can't even read music. So like next to like this caliber of musician, like I'm the dude who's just like, I play rock guitar, like banging on a guitar, like caveman riff shit. But like this tuning, D-A-D-F-A-D, is a really somber sort of morose tuning. It's a minor open chord. And that's the traditional tuning for this somewhat unique instrument. I learned talking to Paul, the viola da amore. So it has that same tuning, D-A-D-F-A-D, which if you're a fan of like Delta blues type shit, Skip James kind of famously used that tuning on a lot of his recordings, like Hard Time Killing Floor Blues and Crow Jane, and these very sort of like eerie, haunting songs. So it's been a tuning that captivated me because I knew it from that end of the spectrum. I had no idea that there was, this history of it being like the central tuning of this one particular instrument. But what's really cool about this instrument is that it also has strings which run underneath the fingerboard of this viola that can't be played or plucked, but just drone in sympathy with whatever is being played. And if you're ever playing in an open tuning, everything kind of vibrates in sympathy with what's being played. To take things a bit further, we also tuned it to 432 hertz, which is a particularly resonant frequency. And normally most things are tuned to 440, so a little bit sharp up there. So this gets down-tuned mildly, but it causes this extra vibrational sort of capacity that when you have an instrument that has a built-in drone function, it just sounds absolutely, to my ear, magical. So yeah, I guess like just sort of through our conversations and our friendship that kind of developed around discussing different esoteric ideas, I was like, well, shoot, you have access to these amazing instruments. Would you like to play on this record? I have a couple of compositions that I think you could play against that would be really, really cool. And that, I felt like, here's a guy who like plays in a symphony for a living. And I'm like, here, let me like record a video on my phone and I'll send it to you. Maybe you can transcribe it and tell me what I'm playing and like play against it. But it was a unique process. Yeah, we're very thankful to have his performance on there. And I think it's like one of the cooler facets of this record. And it's a totally unique instrument that I think is very much in line with everything that we were looking to achieve from as far as the sonic aesthetic is concerned.
conversation, we spoke about esoteric knowledge and magic, and there's a fair bit of music theory and the science behind sound and music in what you're talking about in terms of the scale and the resonant frequencies of the viola d'amore. Both the esoteric and the scientific come together in this tuning that you're talking about. Tell me about this frequency, and why is it called the God frequency?
So, and this is something of a point of contention, because they've alleged all number of other frequencies as also being God frequencies, right? So, but there happens to be, like, I guess, more people, stumping around 432 as the official number. So I guess I will couch this conversation with that and just kind of note that, like, if there's somebody out there screaming at their favorite podcast listening device, no, it's 438. Like, yes, I'm aware there's people have contended that there's a number of different frequencies that are the resonant frequency of everything. But so what I had read is that 432 is like one of these resting resonant frequencies of the manifest universe. And so it has a resonance with everything. And I found that notion to be poetic and quite in line with the broader theme of the record of a prima materia, or fundamental root essence, particularly when I'm employing the analogies of all is mind, all is light, all is sound. And all is sound, if you reduce everything to how it appears as a wavelength, then that's an interesting discussion. But yeah, it was just kind of playing with that notion and kind of fitting that into the broader puzzle of this sort of exploration of prima materia and fundamental root essence, and the idea that there could be something that's so fundamental to being that it's pervasive, And I guess I was just kind of toying with that. And so we ended up tuning all of our tuners to that and recording everything to 432, although not everything's in that DAD FAD tuning that I mentioned with the viola d'amore. But a good deal of the record is, actually, I think 4 of the 8 songs are in that DAD FAD at 432, but everything else is in a different tuning, but also tuned with a baseline of basically calibrating your tuners to A at 432.
So as you mentioned, this is the first album to have Ben Pitts on board. Tell me about Ben's contributions to the studio and how they may have affected the album.
He's a magnificent musician to perform and play with. He definitely adds a lot of great insights too. Music is what that dude basically lives and breathes, and what he wants to do with all of the time that's left over to him when other needs are met. And he and I have known each other for a long time, but I think so. There was a moment, our band's a former band of his and my current band, because Serpents still goes on. We both played a festival in Mexico, like maybe 5 years ago. And Joe, our drummer at the time, and I, and Ben and his wife all basically spent a day together, exploring some Mayan pyramids. And then the following day, exploring these cenotes, the various freshwater caves that are sprinkled throughout that region of Mexico together. And I remember just being oh yeah, we should totally we need to start a band of some kind. And so that little kernel kind of stuck in my mind until I finally had the wherewithal to be yeah, we need to add a third member to this band. And so he was basically the first person I thought of. Okay, if we're going to add somebody else to this band, it's got to be somebody who we get along with well, and is a gifted musician. And he was first dude on the list. But yeah, from a writing perspective, he has wonderful insights. He's got an excellent ear for melody. Dude can basically play any instrument you throw at him, and it's been an absolute pleasure to have him join the band.
How is this album being released?
It's a good question right now. We're in the midst of postponing or outright canceling our record release shows, but we're putting it out. Vinyl to me is kind of the fundamental release. So there's two versions of the vinyl iteration, both of which have like a gatefold sleeve. But the deluxe edition, I became interested in block printing a long time ago, and so I've tried to do like a block print for every release we've done for the last handful of them. But the deluxe edition includes a hand printed gold ink on black paper block print of a block I cut, along with a medallion pendant sort of necklace, the same sort of imagery. That's, if we're getting esoteric with things, it's a 72-fold sun, which is a sun that has 72 rays to it as a nod to, well, 72 has all sorts of sort of resonance to it as a magical number, but one immediate touchstone could be the 72-fold name of God in Kabbalistic lore, which is the Shem HaMafarash. And then it also is going to come with a pleather patch that's gold thread on black pleather. Yeah, and a special color of the vinyl variant. I think it's gold splatter against black vinyl. But then otherwise, like the standard vinyl is still pretty cool looking too. Like it's white against black splatter. So still splatter vinyl, regardless of which one you get. I don't know. I always like. I've always been a nerd for elaborate packaging. So we added a bunch of like spot gloss and UV coating to the sleeve and all that stuff. And I generally just try to make the vinyl release as cool as we can make it. But that'll be coming out on the 15th, and then we've got a CD version as well, like a digipack CD version. And we were going to do a cassette release version, but last I heard that had been kind of held up, given the broader climate of things going on, a plague-besailed world.
Now, have you self-released all the albums up to this point?
We have. We've collaborated with people, like if somebody wanted to like help us do a cassette release or whatever, give them the okay to do so. But yeah, like we're not on a label, haven't really sought label attention.
Is there any particular reason?
I'm not averse to it particularly. It's just like I have the good fortune of being able to continue to do so this way, and so I guess let me go back to my I suppose broader DIY roots, but like one of my favorite all-time bands is Dead Moon, and that band, if they had a record out, it was coming out. It didn't fucking matter if anybody was gonna produce it, right? Like, well, the record's done and it's coming out. So like if somebody wants to do something with it, great, we're open to it. But it's done, and I need to exercise this facet of myself. So this record's coming out one way or another, and we've had enough luck that we've found some semblance of a fan base, and like some of the merch sales and shit can basically make this a self-sustaining thing, even if it's not something that's ever gonna wind up paying the bills of anybody in the band.
Usually, when I ask bands why they self-release, it's either a matter of principle or circumstance or both. In your case, would you say it's more about the principle?
Yes, to some extent. It's not as though like if I got an email from like a larger label or whatever trying to put our shit in record stores across the world, I'd of course have open ears. That's our one thing is like physical distribution is pretty hard from a DIY perspective. And like I still, like maybe I'm a vestige of the past in this respect, but I still cherish the experience of going to a record store and finding new records. And so that's the one thing that like the DIY perspective, at least from what we've done so far, I haven't been really able to cover, is like just getting our shit physically in cool record stores. That's the one thing I would definitely be looking for. Like if, we wanted to work with a label of some kind, but at the same time, I have no delusions of grandeur, and I don't believe that or I have no expectation of Kabbalistically infused esoteric doom metal ever paying my bills. So I'm just happy that we continue to get to do it and play it for people that are appreciative of it. And I don't, I almost like worry if it did become my chief source of income, how that might change what it would be from an artistic perspective. But I don't think we're in much danger of that day coming. So we're still just happy to self-produce at this point.
Lux is the new album by In the Company of Serpents, and as Grant mentioned, it's scheduled to be released on May 15th, 2020. What is the best way for people to order this?
Just straight through our Bandcamp. It's In the Company of Serpents, Doom, Bandcamp. Yeah, just straight through our Bandcamp is the best way to get in touch with us. I had initially earmarked like a good 40 plus copies of our deluxe edition of the new record for exclusive sale at our record release show, which now no longer will be happening given the broader plague winds that prevail. So I'll be updating our web store with the remaining 100 copies of that deluxe edition that has all of the extras that I alluded to earlier, like the block print, etc. But yeah, In the Company of Serpents, Doom.bandcamp.com is the official URL.
And if people want to follow you online, what's the best way to do that?
Our Facebook is just In the Company of Serpents, and then on Instagram and Twitter, just at ITCOS, the initials of the band.
Is there anything else you want to say?
No, thank you for having me, and it's been a fun discussion.
Thank you so much, Grant.
Thank you, Adrian.